were such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about David McCallum. And this is a man who was wrongly convicted for 29 years. Two men were brought in for questioning and never released. The life of a young man was taken, and confessions were said to have solved it. Yet there was quite a bit of deception involved, and the public had no idea until it was all exposed. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. I also want to say that this is a series that I want to be starting on my channel of wrongfully convicted, or who we believe to possibly be wrongfully convicted of certain crimes, because I think it's something that we need to bring more awareness to. But today's story is the case of David McCallum, and it is one that will baffle you in some ways and not surprise you at all in others, unfortunately. So let's get back to the story. So it was 1985 in New York, and a 20-year-old man named Nathan Blenner was living in Queens, and he was really just a guy that was starting his adult years and hadn't yet really found himself, but was working on his goals and his dreams, and he had so much to look forward to. Everyone knew that he was such a great guy, and unfortunately there's not a lot on the internet about Nathan and who he was, but he was known to have, no problems with people. There was never any ill intention for anybody from him, and he just was known to be a good guy, someone who just didn't have a ton of spotlight on them, but didn't need it, because he was just nice. He was a good person, and his life would never be what he thought it was going to be. He never got the chance to fulfill any of those dreams, because on October 20th, he would be carjacked, robbed, and kidnapped in front of his own home. This was in Ozone Park in Queens, and he was forced into a car where he vanished as soon as they left his home. And the search for Nathan began shortly after that, because there were multiple witnesses in the area, which we will get into in a little bit. But he was a Caucasian male with dark hair, and they were searching everywhere. The police were involved, and no one was finding him anywhere. That is when police began to talk to neighbors in the area, and that would include anyone nearby that could have possibly been outside during the time that Nathan was abducted, to tell them any information. And this would really be the beginning of everything, because you see, a woman who lived in the neighborhood was outside at the time washing her car. She claimed that this was an hour before Nathan was taken, and she had seen something that she believed was suspicious. This woman claimed that while she was washing her car on the street, she saw two men. They were two black men who were walking by. And she said this was about a block away from Nathan's home, and the two men caught her attention because they actually spoke to her and said that she had a nice car. I think what this witness said next kind of shows a little bit about her feelings and stereotypes that she had about certain people, because she would willingly tell the police that after these two men had said she had a nice car, she told them that if it was stolen, she would know where to look. And because of this, the officers would begin to look for these two black men. They also had descriptions from other witnesses who were about 11 years old, and these were two kids playing outside at the time, who said that there were two men who came and took this man away, and they appeared to be in their 20s, and one of them had braided hair, but they were both black as well. Now, they said that one was about 5'10" and one was about 5'6". So they were, average, shorter on the male side of the spectrum. And the witnesses were brought into the police department, especially the woman who washed her car, to go through certain mugshots of criminals in the area to see if she could pick out any of them, and she actually said that they were not in there. The children who had witnessed this had said that these two men had basically told Nathan to get the F in his car, and they shoved him in and then they sped away, and the whole thing it happened kind of in the blink of an eye. It wasn't very long between when they approached him and when they took him away. And the search for Nathan continued, but it didn't have to be much longer, wanting to know what had happened, because the next day he would actually be found in Brooklyn at Aberdeen Park. And this was said to be a very rough area at the time, but Nathan unfortunately was deceased with a gunshot wound to the head, and he was also missing his wallet. He was just lying in the middle of this park. Of course, that's when the missing persons case turned into a homicide, and more witnesses were questioned, and many neighbors were brought in to give any information that they possibly had. Many neighbors then said that they too saw Nathan being shoved into his own car, and they had a description of this vehicle saying that it was a Buick Regal. Now, they were on the lookout for this car, especially after hearing what it was and having the descriptions of it. And this, they believed, could ultimately lead them to the perpetrators. But instead of this happening, police would get a call from a security guard, and this was on Fulton Street in Brooklyn, and the security guard would say that there was a car on fire in the middle of the road, and the youths had put it there and set it on fire, like a group of young people. And when they got there, this in fact was Nathan's vehicle, and all of the DNA evidence, being that there was a fire, could have disappeared. But at this point, DNA evidence wasn't even yet a thing, so that's not something that they were really concerned about at this time, but they had no idea how much they could possibly be losing for this case to be looked at in the future. Investigators did have two possible suspects, and these were two individuals who had already been questioned for carjacking in the area, which is exactly what they had done, the two suspects had done to Nathan. They had just abducted him on top of that. And so investigators, knowing that they had previously talked to these two men who were in their 20s, they were named Terrence Hayward and Herman Mumford, and they were in their 20s, they were both black, and they fit the description that these witnesses had said. So they questioned them in Nathan's case, and they said that they had nothing to do with it, and there was no evidence to connect them, so they were released. However, they didn't leave investigators with nothing, because Terrence would speak up before they left and tell investigators that even though he didn't do it, he may have known who did. Now, he said that a 16-year-old named Willie Stuckey had told a friend of his that he had killed someone with the gun that he was holding. He in fact used the words that the gun had a body on it, and when he tried to give it to this person, that is when this person told Terrence, and that's how Terrence knew that Willie had this gun. Now, if this was the case, all the witnesses had seen two individuals. So if Willie was guilty, who was the second person? It didn't take long to find the second suspect, because Willie had a friend who was his same age, 16 years old, who was named David McCallum. He was a boy from a big family, and with Terrence's help, investigators tracked them down and brought them into custody 7 days after Nathan had been found. So the killers were finally arrested, or so everyone thought. The detective working on this case was named Detective Buddha, and he would come out of questioning both of them with two different confessions. Both Willie and David said they carjacked and killed Nathan Blenner. And so with these statements, of course, this was released to the public, and everyone was ecstatic. Nathan's family felt like they could finally get justice and they could heal from all of this, and everyone believed that they had the answers and it was case closed. However, what they didn't know was that these two boys gave completely different statements and confessions, and they did not match. the actual crime scene. Willie's statement said that David had killed Nathan and shot him 3 different times, whereas David's statement said that Willie had killed him and shot him once. Now, the problem was these were differing statements, and Nathan had only been shot once, not the 3 times Willie was saying that David had done. Willie also said that they did talk to a woman and told her that she had a nice vehicle, further corroborating that witness's statement. So, on the surface, yes, they did confess. However, the discrepancies within those confessions were what was the most terrifying, that people didn't know, and these 2 16-year-olds had no idea what was about to become of them. Because, you see, they were blaming each other and nobody really knew this was happening, but why would they be blaming each other? Was this, a cover-up and they just didn't want to be in trouble, so they decided, we did this, but I'm going to blame it on the other person so they get more? Or was this because neither of them did it and they just didn't want to be found guilty on their own, so they blamed the other? The only thing that they did agree on was that Nathan had been killed at night and they took his car on a joyride right afterwards. As the investigators, the family, the public celebrated these confessions and these killers being off the street, Willie and David would recant their statements. And they would both say that they had been slapped, they had been abused, they had been threatened to have chairs thrown at them if they didn't say what the officers wanted them to say. Now that they were out of harm's way, and I'm sure with lawyers, they wanted to make it clear that they did not do this and they had lied so they could basically get out of the questioning and go home. One of the biggest inconsistencies between the confessions and the autopsy was the time of death, because the medical examiner actually found that Nathan had been alive for a very short period after he had been abducted. So it would have been around 3:15 p.m. when he would have been killed, which was still daylight. And both of the boys had said that they killed him at night. But this is not the story that the media told the public. So the public were really pushing a guilty verdict because they believed that these 2 monsters had just taken a life. And so, as everyone went to trial, they believed these 2 16-year-olds should be found guilty. And that is when both Willie and David were offered 10 years off of their possible 25 years to life sentence if they would just plead guilty in a plea deal. And they both refused to do so, saying that they were not guilty and would not be saying so. They said that they were innocent and that regardless of what the statement said, they had lied. Unfortunately, they had both written documents and videotaped documents of their confessions, which would be used at trial. A year after Nathan's murder, his mother, Deborah, sat in the Kings County Supreme Court room and listened to this trial and all of the evidence, and it was quite slim. They had nothing as far as forensics to link these 2 boys to this murder. They also had witness statements saying that there was 2 boys who were black around this neighborhood. However, none of them confirmed that it was Willie or David. And something that, really stood out was the fact that there was one main description of one of these boys that said that he had braids. And that's what everybody said. There was one boy who had braids. However, neither Willie or David had braids. This was something that wasn't taken into consideration at all. But if it would have been, someone could have seen the fact that neither of them had braids, but someone that they knew did. Because that first suspect that they talked to, Terrence, who told them about Willie, well, he had braids. October 22nd would be a day that Willie and David would never forget, because they were both found guilty of 2nd-degree murder, 1st-degree kidnapping, 1st-degree robbery, and criminal use of a weapon. Their sentence, 25 years to life as 16-year-old boys. Now, they would be staying in many different jails over the years, but it would eventually end up in Otis Correctional Facility in New York. Instead of graduating school, going on to get jobs and start families, these boys would grow up in prison. You know, you guys know that I do a series called Kids Who Kill here on this channel, and that is because I know that there are children out there who are monsters and who can be extremely scary and manipulative and make you feel like they haven't done a thing when they are evil. And we've seen quite a bit of them in cases I've done here. And so I'm definitely not saying that it's just because they're a kid that I feel this way. There is no evidence in this case, and that is what is the most infuriating, because these children were put away for life even though there was no evidence against them. And also the fact that the evidence really did appear to be forced out of them, and they both said right after they had given those confessions that that is exactly what happened, and nobody listened. And this is something that happens to a ton of Black individuals who will be brought in for a crime because of their skin color, because officers think that their skin color makes them guilty of this crime. In this case, we do have witness statements saying it was Black individuals. And, you know, I hope that none of those witnesses were lying. But in a lot of cases, there is not, you know, witnesses that say that that's who did it. But officers will often bring in people of color, including Black individuals, and make them feel like they have no choice but to confess, to stay on the good side of the officers, because if they don't, they are afraid of what will happen. And this is what happened in this case as well. And a good example of this is the Central Park 5 case, which does have a, you know, docu-series on it on Netflix if you want to watch it. I'll link it down below. It just shows a lot about the injustice. But they grew up in prison. They went from 16 years old to going into their 20s, and they appealed many times, all of which were denied. The Blenner family, Nathan's family, was healing, and they believed the killers were in custody, and so they could rest assured that something like this wouldn't happen again and that their son got justice. But they had no idea that this was all a lie. 16 years later, all hope pretty much vanished, especially for Willie, because he would actually die of a heart attack December of 2001, still behind bars. So now it was only David left to get justice, and he continued to fight to see the outside world once again. David's mother, Ernestine, said that David had always been such a great student. He never got in trouble. He was loved by his siblings. He had 6 of them, and he was such a good brother to them. The family had actually moved to New York when he was 8, and he was instantly overwhelmed by everything, you know, going on in New York City, and he tried to really adjust quickly, you know, and make friends, and it seemed like he did do okay. But whatever he did, his main passion followed him everywhere, and this was that he wanted to be a firefighter. He wanted to be important. He wanted to be a hero, and he wanted to do good. However, the friends he was making at this time were not the best role models, and so he was getting into some trouble, and he was trying to prove to them that he was tough, that he could avoid being the prey, and this is something that he felt he had to do in such a tough, you know, neighborhood and environment, to make people believe he was strong so they wouldn't pick on him. David would wait 10 more long years, 26 years in total, for this case to be reopened even a crack. His lawyer would tell him that they finally decided to test the DNA from Nathan's car, because DNA testing was now a thing and it wasn't before, and the fire had not gotten rid of all of that evidence, thankfully, because DNA had been found years later, and this was on cigarette butts in the car. They knew that these couldn't be Nathan's because from his family members, they told them that Nathan did not smoke and would not allow it in his vehicle. So if this was a friend of his, he wouldn't have allowed that to be in there. The only option for why this was here was if it was from the 2 men who had shoved him in. So if they could just have a DNA match to somebody else besides David and Willie, this could free them. But investigators were thinking they just needed it to match to David and Willie because they were already in prison and had been for 26 years. That is when a DNA profile would be made from these items, and they would match to a man that was identified with a criminal record. But this was not Willie nor David. And this person has not been released to the public that I could find, but his lawyer, who was new to him and who was being paid for by some friends that David had made outside of prison, which we will talk about in a little bit, they found that during their trial, the jury had not been told about the two suspects that had been questioned before them, Terrence and Herman. Terrence was the one who told the officers about Willie, and the jury didn't know about these two men at all. This would not be the end of the fight, unfortunately, though, because 2 years later, in 2013, even with this newfound evidence, the district attorney said that no evidence supported that David was innocent, and they were basically not going to do anything with it. Thankfully, a few years later, a new district attorney would be elected named Kenneth Thompson, and that is when everything changed. He was actually contacted by a famous boxer who was named Rubin Hurricane Carter, and he unfortunately was on his deathbed. Rubin was. And he himself had actually been cleared of triple murder. He had been in prison 19 years after being wrongfully convicted, so he knew a little about cases like David and Willie's. He had actually been convicted of 3 murders that happened in the Lafayette Grill when 2 black men were said to shoot up the restaurant. These victims were Jim Oliver, who was a bartender who had volunteered to work that night, who was 51 years old, as well as Fred Nayux, who was 60 and worked at the local factory but was there just on his time off to drink some and to relax a little bit. There was also another man who was there at this time who was named William Marins, who was actually shot too, but he played dead and he would survive. Another woman would also survive named Hazel Tanis, but Rubin Carter, who was this well-known boxer even back then at this time, he and John Artis, who was a delivery driver, who they both lived very normal lives, 29 and 19 years old. They were both convicted because Hazel, one of the survivors, had described these men and they believed that it was Rubin and John. However, when she was said to pick out mugshots, their mugshots were in this lineup and she didn't pick them out. Bob Dylan, like the Bob Dylan, knew Rubin Carter and tried to even help him to get out of jail, and this didn't help either. He was convicted for 19 years. 2 decades later, that is when it was finally looked into, and it was found that 2 small-time criminals were actually used as witnesses in this case, and it was overturned by a judge who said they were predicated upon an appeal to racism rather than reason and concealment rather than disclosure. And they were finally released, but they had lost 19 years of their life to being wrongfully convicted. And Rubin was going to help David not face any more years of the same. Rubin Carter's dying wish to Kenneth Thompson, the new district attorney, was that David's case be reopened. He knew all too well what it felt like to live in prison for a crime you didn't commit, and he was going to do everything he could, even as he was passing away, to make this end for David. Thankfully, Kenneth Thompson fulfilled this request. He would find that both Willie and David had been fed facts from the police, and no actual evidence connected them to the crime. Kenneth also began to look into the confessions that were both written and recorded, and they were completely different. He was seeing all the things that investigators saw back then, had to have seen, but that weren't released to the public or at trial. He also found that the woman who washed the car and who had given the, descriptions of these men, and they looked nothing like David and Willie. She was even said to say that Willie and David were not the men she saw. Willie had also told investigators that the gun that he used was hidden and that it was under his mattress, and they went to go search for it and never found it, and in fact never found the gun at all. At this trial, the joyride that Willie and David were said to go on after murdering Nathan was a huge factor in all of this, because it showed, they had no remorse. They just wanted to go steal this car, and they were going to kill this man just so they could take his car away. And that's when it came out that neither Willie nor David had ever been seen to drive, because they didn't drive, ever. New York City is not a place where you have to have a car. Neither of these 16-year-olds drove. So how would this be possible? With all of this, Kenneth wanted to talk to as many people as possible who had, had a part in all of this leading up to the conviction. However, unfortunately, the detective who had first gotten the confessions out of them had passed away and he couldn't be talked to. Now, David had a lot to say, and he was finally getting a voice to tell his side of the story. He said that October 20th was a Sunday, and he woke up like every morning and ate his breakfast and was really excited. He would hang out with his family for a while. In fact, one of his favorite people was his sister, who had cerebral palsy, who he believed was his hero, that she was so strong and was the strongest person he had ever met. And so he would spend time with them, and then he would go down with some of his siblings and his friends to a park to play. He and his sister played ball at this certain playground, and Willie was there that day, and then they spent the whole day there playing before going home around 6:30, of course, when it was getting dark. Nathan Blenner was already deceased by the time they would get home, and so 7 days later, he was being picked up on a grocery store run for his family by the police, and he would never return home. He said he didn't know what was going on. He was just being taken to the interrogation room, and that's when David informed that he was being accused of murder by Willie. And Willie even came in the room and said that was him. David was saying he didn't know what was going on. He refused having anything to do with it. And that's when he began to be threatened and hit. And he said that he just said what the officers wanted to hear. David said that he had to point his fingers at Willie to get himself out of it. He said that the only way he knew he could do this was if he made them believe his story over Willie's, and so he went into detail. He was making up all of these different details and stories about what had happened, and then once they got the story correct, that's when he would go and make his recorded confession. And I will insert it right here for you to listen to.
Sir, what is your name?
David McCallum.
Oh, okay, Mr. McCallum. You have the right to remain silent. That is, you do not have to speak to me or answer any of my questions. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Anything you say to me can be used as evidence against you in a court of law. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
Now that I've advised you of your rights, do you want to speak to me about what happened?
Yes. We had brought the man in through the exit of the car and took him through the back.
Okay.
My friend, huh?
Let me start you from earlier in the day, okay?
Right.
Okay, where were you earlier in the day?
So we got off the train in Queens, and there was this parked car, and there was this man sitting there. He stuck the gun to the car window and told the man to get out. So the man got out, and we had got in, and he told the man to get back in, so he got back in. And then the guy asked us where we was going. He said we was going for a little ride. I just asked, what you doing? He just told the guy, you know what time it is. Then he clicked, and then the gun went off, and then the guy fell, and he was laying on the ground. And his arms, he was moving his arms until he had left. He had the gun, Willie Stuckey, he had the gun on at all times.
After Willie fired the gun the first time, did he fire any other shots after that?
No, only one shot.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Now, I do want to point out something that I found that was quite interesting was that he kind of goes right into it, because when you're being told what to say, you don't, make up little things you're trying to remember, so you're gonna go straight into that story, which is exactly what he did. And that's when, the person who was talking to him was saying, no, let's backtrack a little bit, and kind of getting him to feed in other information before then. Because the biggest sign of it being a false-fed confession is if there is no more information than what the officers already know, which in both cases that's exactly what it was. Willie and David didn't know any more than what they were being told. After that, they finally called David's mother. He was only 16 years old and shouldn't have been talked to alone, and they didn't care. They said she couldn't even see him yet. David's confession was said to be the biggest regret of his life, but he didn't let this consume him, even in prison. In fact, he started helping people. He came in contact with a man named Klonsky, and he was just talking to him and writing letters, and he would go visit him, and then said that his son, who was, about the same age as David was when he was incarcerated, he was having some trouble, and he was getting into lots of trouble and couldn't really control him anymore. So he asked David, can you talk to him about what can happen if you're on, the wrong side of the law, if you are hanging out with the wrong people? And David actually said, yeah, I would love to. It would be my honor. David did his best to explain what he had been through and why he needed to try his best to change his life around. He encouraged him to do better and make a better life for himself than the path he was going down currently. And he said it was a privilege to be talking to him, and he kind of turned into an older brother for this teenage boy, and he would often go and visit David in jail and just really get to know him on a deeper level. Klonsky family was actually the one who ended up getting David a lawyer and put him in contact with Rubin Carter, who was also fighting for his release. And this was, well before he was on his deathbed, and he was the face of this campaign to get David's case reopened. Now, they also found, with some private investigators' help, who this DNA that was found in Nathan's car actually belonged to. And they didn't release his name either, but he was said to be 14 years old at the time of the murder, and so they believed he wasn't actually the murderer, but he knew something. So they spoke to him, and they didn't believe he really wanted to talk to them or wanted to confess, but that he truly did know more than he was letting on. This man said that he threw his cigarette butts in a lot of different abandoned cars, and that's probably what happened. They also found that later on, the woman who had been washing her car at the time, who made the big confession, her name was Chrissy. She had the same kind of car as Nathan did. That's a little bit of information we didn't know. She drove the same car as Nathan, who was taken and killed for his car, so everyone thought. And her car was actually stolen a few days later. Now, of course, Willie and David were still free at this point, but where would they have put a car while they were being interrogated? They couldn't have gone and hidden it because they didn't even know they were going to be brought in. This meant that the likelihood of those men that she saw being involved in Nathan's murder was higher than anyone expected. But like we talked about, one of them had braids and Willie and David did not. And braiding hair isn't something that's so easy to, take out and get rid of. It takes time, and you're going to leave those braids in for quite a bit of time. And so there's really a very slim chance that one of these boys would have had braids and quickly taken them out before they were taken in for questioning. The gas can was also found that was used to set Nathan's car on fire, and it was traced to a hardware store nearby. And guess who worked there? Terrence. The same boy with the braids, the same boy who blamed it on Willie. Terrence was actually the first person brought in this murder because they believed it was him immediately. He was taken from his home, like I said, almost immediately, like 2 days after the murder actually happened, whereas, of course, Willie and David were taken 7 days after. So this was 2 days after he was brought in, and his family said that Terrence wasn't the type to back down from what he was saying, even if he was being threatened by police. So their tactics wouldn't have really worked on him because he would have continued to say, I didn't do it, no matter what kind of abuse they were putting him through. So is that why they turned to younger boys who would be easier to persuade, especially when Terrence pointed the fingers at them anyway? At this point, David's 4th parole hearing was coming up. He had been denied every one since, but he was such a model prisoner, and that he truly kept hope that this would be the time that he would be released. He says that the system is clearly broken, but it can be fixed. And unfortunately, he was denied once again because they believed he would be at risk to the safety of the community. But this is going to have a happy ending because David McCallum would get to see the light when the new DA, Kenneth Thompson, would actually bump him to the top of the list of wrongful convictions that he was working on in the area. And on October 15th, 2014, after 29 years in prison, he would go to trial. This is when the convictions against Willie Stuckey and David McCallum would be thrown out due to false confessions supplied by the police. It was said the evidence available to the district attorney after the investigation sufficiently convinces the court that the judgments of conviction should be vacated. The new DA, Kenneth Thompson, said that he inherited a legacy of disgrace about the wrongful convictions from the previous DA, who refused to look into any of the cases and said that if they had been convicted, they were guilty for life. David was going to be released at 45 years old, and hearing this, he began to sob as the courtroom applauded and just broke out in cheers. And it was so bittersweet because David said that he should not have been walking out alone. Willie should have been by his side, and he did walk out with his mother, David did, saying that they finally did it. And his mother was right by his side, so proud of him, supported him the entire time because she knew he was never guilty. He went to see his sister immediately after, who was actually only supposed to live till 13 years old, and like I said, he believed that she was the strongest person he ever knew, and she had actually lived till 52 years old. And part of me does wonder, was it because of her want and passion to see her brother again? It does make me wonder. I don't believe she speaks, so we don't really know to ask her, but that would be cool if she, persevered and had the strength because she knew that she was going to see her brother again many, many years later. So many people are put behind bars knowing that they did no wrong and not having a way to get out of it. That's what this series is gonna be about, or telling the stories of the people who did get out, just so they get more justice for all the years that they lost, because there are still so many people who are losing years, and that's something you can never get back. And the fact that they could be sitting there thinking that no one believes them. In 2016, Willie's mother actually settled a federal civil rights lawsuit for $3 million. Now, the Blenner family, Nathan's family, the murder victim, they were horrified after hearing that David had been released, not because he was, going out on the streets because he was found innocent, but because they believed this case was solved and that the killers were caught and that they no longer had to fear because Nathan had justice. They had grieved, they had healed, and now this was just opening up that wound that could never be fully healed. And they were mainly upset with the previous lawyers and the judge who led them to believe that these men were guilty of his murder when they let the real killers loose, and they had been walking loose and free this entire time. They said that nobody wants to see an innocent man go to jail, but they did want justice. They still do, and now they have to fight for it again. They were not included in any of these new trials. They were also told that as the victim's family, they really had no rights in this, and they're really upset because David's wrongful conviction has kind of been put over Nathan's murder. And I could really see that in these cases or not in these cases, but in the resources that I looked up. It is, there's a lot more information about David than Nathan. And when you search Nathan Blenner, David's picture comes up and really not his picture at all, and I couldn't find any. I will try to find as many pictures as I can. And hearing that, I wanted to do more in depth about Nathan's case, which is why I started with his case, but unfortunately there is very little information on what exactly happened other than what I told you. As amazing as it is that David was exonerated, Nathan's killer is still on the loose. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged as well, and needs to be taken care of, because the family was done an injustice by putting these men behind bars as well as these men were. A year later, there has actually been interviews with David done, and he was working in a job he loved. He had actually met a woman on Tinder. I mean, he was 16 years old when he entered prison, so he probably didn't even have a girlfriend, maybe didn't even have his first kiss by then. But he is very adamant that he wants a family and he wants that sort of love surrounding him, and he's working really hard to get back up to date with everything that is different in the world from how it was back then. I mean, the technology itself is just insanely different. He's really just trying to update himself, and he's just grateful in general for everyday life. And it's really nice to see that he is just so happy being out, regardless of how different it is, how hard it is, or that he has to work. You know, most of us are like, I don't want to get up every day. I don't want to go back to work. And he is just so grateful he gets to do that. And I think that is so beautiful. So I'm really happy to have been able to share David's story and tell you a bit about what happened to him, because he's a victim as well. He's a victim of the criminal justice system, and his story deserves to have light on it, and so does Nathan's. You know, I would have loved to focus it around Nathan more, but unfortunately we just don't know much. And I think that this case in general is one that was failed big time. And we need to be a lot more careful of the evidence and keeping prosecutors at a standard where they don't just convict people because they think that they can, or they just want to solve a case. They do it because they have enough evidence. And I know that Daniel Helen was just talking about an organization called Color of Change that helps fight that, and, you know, is working towards having prosecutors be held accountable. There's also a program called the Innocence Project that works for cases like this, so I'll have that linked down below as well if you want to read more information about it. And overall, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this new series, and if you have any cases you want me to cover, it can be someone who has been proven, or it can be someone who people believe is innocent. And we can kind of talk about that as well. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.